Good evening. I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writing and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture. We're grateful to our partner this evening, the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, and for additional promotional support from Alabama Public TV, Alabama River Diversity Network, the Cincinnati Zoo, the E.O. Wilson Biophilia Center at Nogosi Plantation, Harvard University Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology, the Museum of Comparative Zoology, Orion Quarterly, University of Alabama Museums, and Yale Environment 360. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our nonprofit mission. No one has done more to awaken us to the surprise and wonder and astonishing diversity of life on Earth, and to its fragility and mounting devastation than Edward O. Wilson, transformative scientist and Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. Tonight, 51 springs since the first Earth Day, we mark publication of this volume of 3 masterworks: E.O. Wilson, Biophilia, The Diversity of Life, Naturalist, volume 340 in the Library of America series, edited by David Quammen, who joins us shortly. This Library of America edition was prepared in consultation with Professor Wilson and published with support from Peter Georgi and the Georgi Family Foundation, who have also endowed it through the Guardians of American Letters Fund to keep it permanently in print. Thanks to their generosity, it will stand as a lasting testimony to E.O. Wilson and his contributions to science, to American writing, and to the cause of global conservation. To discuss Wilson and his legacy, we're incredibly fortunate to have a distinguished panel of his colleagues and friends. Award-winning journalist, botanist, and natural historian Bill Finch joins us from Alabama, where he is founding director of the Paint Rock Forest Research Center and senior fellow for the Ocean Foundation. Joining us from Montana, I believe, renowned nature and science writer David Quammen, editor of this new LOA collection, is the author of 4 novels and 11 nonfiction works, most recently, The Tangled Tree, a radical new history of life. And joining us from California is Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Richard Rhodes. He's written 26 books, most recently Scientist, a biography of E.O. Wilson, forthcoming this fall. The panelists join us in a moment. We begin with a brief clip from the 2015 documentary E.O. Wilson of Ants and Men, provided by filmmaker Graham Townsley. Following that, a message from Paula Erhlich, President and CEO of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. A reminder that our guests tonight invite your questions, which you can submit at any time using the Q&A button on your menu bar. If you do, please let us know where you're viewing from. And now, here's a clip from Of Ants and Men, produced by Graham Townsley and directed by Shelley Schulze.
So I wanted that word biodiversity to remind us how little we know about the natural world and of the danger that we destroy it before we even know it's there. The loggers and the corporate executives arrive at these forests before the scientists do. So by the time we show up, it's already cut down. We're beginning to understand the fragility, the elegance, the exquisite locking together of the relationships of these large numbers of plant and animal species we find in these surviving natural areas. It isn't just a matter of number of species now, it's a matter of the immense number of ways species interact with one another to form ecosystems. In all my work now, I want to drive home to people just how complex the natural world is and just how precious. Well, I love it.
Ed has become so important to us now. His voice has become so important to us, I think in part because he talks about life. And he talks about what it means to live. And it's, I think, an increasing recognition that our path requires us to develop this relationship with all life.
Our path requires us to develop this relationship with all of life. I love that. Thank you, Bill. It's E.O. Wilson's, Ed's hope in this moment that students everywhere can be empowered to experience what he has, to use his life as an example of what they themselves can do, and to hopefully be exposed to the same generosity of spirit that has enabled him to tread a path that empowered his life and career about what it has become, truly an extraordinary relationship with all of life. In all the personal stories that flow through Ed's books, there's a sort of a through line about this and an eagerness to share that experience as an inspiration to others. They are stories about his particular holy grail, being a good scientist in pursuit of the sheer delight of knowledge. In Biophilia, he writes about the discovery of natural law marked by elegance, which he defines as the right mix of simplicity and latent power. In 32 years after he wrote Biophilia, this culminated in the latent power of a very simple idea and book, Half Earth, which is the work of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation and the Half Earth Project, and which embodies his hope that all of us raise our ambition to care for our planet. So how do we get there? What is the path? Ed told me a couple of stories the other day about how he became a naturalist and also why he did it in a certain way. Ed said his father was a bit of a wanderer. One of the results of his father's peregrinations, as Ed called them, was that Ed went to 16 different schools in 12 years. And when he would come into a place, he had a routine, maybe even a mission, to find out everything he possibly could about the natural world of that place. He was an explorer, already studying fire ants and getting some attention for that, when in 1943, at the age of 14, when there were no young men left to be counselors at the summer Boy Scout camp, he was asked to be a camp counselor. He was given responsibility and self-confidence to do what he had already been doing by habit. They had every confidence in him, and so he had confidence in himself. He was now a naturalist. And this happened again in a slightly different way when he was beginning his pursuit of his PhD, now at University of Tennessee. Ed said the faculty must have been really impressed by him. One wrote an acquaintance at Harvard and said, "This kid doesn't belong here," encouraging an invitation for Ed to apply to Harvard. As Ed wrote in Naturalist, it was his destiny. After all, Harvard had the largest collection of ants in the world. But this story was about something else. It provides evidence for a second important component of the path. It illustrates a sort of altruism, a feeling of generosity and willingness to work above other potential interests for the good of a field of science. At the end of Ed's first year at Harvard, he was elected to the prestigious Society of Fellows, which had only one mandate: do something extraordinary. Go anywhere and do anything you want, but make it extraordinary. And so, as we know, yeah, he did. He said to me, imagine if a billionaire had said to you, I just want you to be a major success. He said, hope is a dedicated partner. And I said, huh, that's what you did for me. And he said, yeah. My sense of why we read books is because we seek that camaraderie in the world. To find on the page someone who sets store by your particular insight. One legacy of E.O. Wilson's books, beyond the way they illuminate science through poetry, is built into the personal stories within every one. It's Ed's sense that the best way to teach is to teach through your own life, your own experience, which could become a shared one. Throughout, he's a master to imitate, who's also looking at you as a promising apprentice, just like someone did for him, and absolutely knowing that with that gift, that you will do something absolutely extraordinary. I'm thrilled to introduce onto the stage some absolute torchbearers of that wisdom. Welcome to David Quammen, Bill Finch, and Richard Rhodes.
Paula, thank you very much. Thank you so much. Let's see, there we go. Now I'm with you in video, and I trust that you can hear me as well. I'm certainly very glad to be part of this, very honored to be part of this, very grateful for the Edward O. Wilson Foundation for putting this on, and also to the Library of America, the wonderful people at the Library of America, Max Rudin and John Koka and Matt Parr and others who have helped us put together this wonderful book of 3 of Ed's greatest books in one volume. And I am tickled by the opportunity to have a conversation with 2 of my colleagues about Ed and his work tonight. And to the audience, Paula has already made clear that although we revere him as Professor Wilson, we think of him as Ed, because he is an unpretentious, sweet-spirited, generous man. And I just wish you all had the opportunity that we have to know him as a friend, as well as a writer and a scientist. So let me start with some questions to Richard and to Bill. And I have a lot of questions, more than we can get through. So feel free, if you wish, to be pungent and concise, or to expatiate as you see fit. Let's start with this. Ed has been a towering presence, or a founder, in several different scientific fields. Island biogeography, he was one of the founders of systematized island biogeography along with Robert MacArthur. Sociobiology, he synthesized that very powerfully and controversially in the 70s. Biodiversity studies, the taxonomy and behavior of ants. So Richard and Bill, which of those scientific roles first brought him to your attention?
You know, I met Ed more than 40 years ago. I was interested in a particular question about an evolutionary part of some behaviors. I won't go into the details, but that day when I went up to his lab to meet him, he said, "Do you want to see the Kinsey collection?" And he took me down the hall and he showed me some 4 million beetles that Alfred Kinsey, the famous sexologist, had collected before he got started collecting human behaviors. it's as if, and some people have said since then that Kinsey used the same technique for both beetles and humans, which is probably true. But over the years, it really has been Ed's approach to the question of how much of behavior is genetic, how much is learned. That's what really got him into trouble when he was presenting his ideas about sociobiology. So it's kind of been Ed, not surprisingly, that really was at the center of my understanding of the man, and still is today.
Bill?
You know, David, it's interesting. We talk a lot about biodiversity and how Ed has changed our ideas about diversity. The idea of focusing just on diversity is not something that I think a lot of people had really thought about in the comprehensive way that Ed had. But there's another point, and it's really interesting. I'm thinking about it more and more. And it goes back to that, the theory of island biogeography. And for the first time, well, Ed reinvigorated the idea that not only are species important, but species have a place. And if we're really going to understand species, we got to understand what that place is and how they fit into it and how that place shapes them. And, you know, it's interesting, that path. You might think that's pretty simple, but I just want to look at The Naturalist, read the book The Naturalist, and see what's happening as Ed is introducing this theory that place is important, that ecosystems are important. Look at what's happening in molecular biology. It was going to be left behind. Ed reinvigorated that. And now it's coming full circle in things like Half Earth and some of Ed's new ideas, which I think we'll see more of. The idea that place is important. Species have a place, and we need to think about that.
Bill, you mentioned this book.
Yeah.
Folks, I don't know if you can see this.
Yes.
If you haven't heard of it, this is a little drab monograph published by Princeton University Press in 1967. It is one of the founding documents of modern conservation biology, the theory of island biogeography. As Bill just said, that was the point where Ed and his great partner, Robert MacArthur, systematized what seemed like a fringe aspect of ecology and revealed that to understand evolution and extinction, evolution leading to biodiversity and extinction being the threat against it, you need to understand islands, because the world is being broken up into islands. And they systematized ecology through systematizing this idea of islands as the places where things evolve and where things go extinct. Bill, you mentioned the book Naturalist, his autobiography published in 1994. Here he is after 40 years as a distinguished and restlessly theorizing scientist. And he titles the book Naturalist. And I noticed, Richard, that you titled your biography Scientist. So what do you think he was telling us with that title? And what are you telling us?
You know, one of the aspects of Ed's life that was really been fascinating was his real battle with Jim Watson, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. Watson arrived at Harvard the same month Ed did, and was determined to tear down the whole naturalism-based version of biology that was the primary version then taught at Harvard, because in his zeal and enthusiasm for molecular biology, Watson was quite convinced that you could do it all in the lab, that all you needed was chemistry and physics, basically. And the rest would fall into place logically by building up from there. Ed's joke to me at one point was, they didn't even know the names of organisms. They needed us to help them out with that. But it was a long and painful and drawn out battle between those two men and their cadre of colleagues to try and, in Ed's case, to save the naturalist aspect, meaning the part where you go out in the field and actually look at organisms and how they organize and how they live and how they interact with each other, island-wise and so forth, against a general movement into the laboratory, which was a lot more glamorous and seemed to people like Watson much more scientific. Ed's way of getting at that wasn't to just argue, but it was rather to try to inform the somewhat broken up naturalist version of their biology with the science part. He tried to find ways to look at field studies that would pose theoretical questions and then find ways to answer those questions. One of my favorite versions of that was an experiment that he conducted down in the Florida Keys with Dan Simberloff, where they actually took some tiny little Florida keys. The biggest one was something like 1/4 of an acre, and some of them were not much bigger than the size of an automobile, and sterilized them. Basically, they looked all over Miami for some extermination company that would be willing to sterilize these keys, and eventually figured out a way to drop a tent over these keys and kill all the organisms there. And then they took the tents away, and it was as if Krakatoa had once again erupted and was sterile, and now organisms were going to move in and find their places and interact with each other. So this was an actual experiment, and an absolutely fascinating one that was conducted by Wilson and Simberloff that resulted in some reproducible results. And it was by this process of bringing the formal structure of scientific research into the field in a way it had not been before, I think, by and large, that Ed was able to incorporate molecular biology's approach into the naturalist approach. But of course, his heart was always with the field. And I think that's why the book is called Naturalist and not my title, Scientist.
And that experiment,
scientist, naturalist, that would have been better.
That experiment with Dan Simberloff, Richard, don't you think you could say that that was maybe one of the first signal moments in ecology as an experimental science?
Evidently it was, yes, absolutely.
Bill, what about this? This identifying himself in his autobiography as a naturalist, as opposed to calling himself a scientist. Of course, he always admits that he's both. But to emphasize that, what was he telling us by emphasizing that?
We talk about this all the time, and it's what we're losing out of science is contact with the natural world. And biophilia is about sort of rethinking our contact with the natural world and how important that contact is. So it is, as Richard says, it's very important that science understand that contact with the natural world, but it's also important that all of us understand the importance of contacting the natural world. You know, in some ways, I think the book Biophilia is like turning sociobiology on its head and sort of saying, you know, y'all want to argue about all this, but I want to talk to you about what the contact with life means for you as humans, how it makes you better, not how it limits you, not how it makes you worse, but how it makes you better. And biophilia was very important in that. And always with Ed, it's about really contacting these things, touching these things, making them tangible, knowing what an oak looks like, knowing what different species of ants are and how they react in the field.
So he's growing up in Alabama, a number of different places, but he tends to emphasize Alabama as he tells the story. And he's living in the bayous and the stream banks and the swamps amid the water moccasins, as a boy does. You're in Alabama.
Yeah.
Grown up Alabama boy. Help us understand what Alabama in particular gives to this sort of a path.
Yeah, well, I always think, let me go back, Kubla Khan has references to Alabama in it, Coleridge's Kubla Khan. It was a great tropical paradise for much of Europe. And it was a tropical paradise for Ed. It still is, in some ways, at least a semi-tropical paradise, yeah, a subtropical paradise. The diversity of life here is really very high. Alabama, when we hear the image, when we hear the name Alabama, we come up with all sorts of images about what that means, what that symbol means to the country. But it's important to understand this. It's the center of biodiversity in Eastern North America. One of the great centers of aquatic diversity in the world, certainly in the temperate world. Center of turtle diversity in the Western Hemisphere. I could go on and on. Center of oak diversity in North America, north of Mexico. So it's really an extraordinary place for biodiversity and an extraordinary place to grow up in. You know, we grow up with all these turtles and we see them run over on the street all the time. We don't think much about them. But Ed said, boy, this is incredible. There's lots of them. I want to understand them. I want to understand 40 species of snakes. I want to understand all of these species of ants. And he had an opportunity to do it here. It's an interesting question. I don't know if I like asking it, but it's worth asking. If he had grown up in Minnesota, what would have happened?
Perfect, thank you.
Let me add to that. One of the things that I've found over the years in writing about many different kinds of scientists is, and not just science, almost any field, if you grow up in it, you've already done your first 10,000 hours by the time you reach adulthood, and you know it in a deep way. Ed had that experience, and I think it has never failed him. He was a barefoot boy running around the swamps, basically, and picking things up and looking at them. He didn't even bother to learn their names. He just wanted to see them and think about them and compare them to each other, collect them, see if he could handle them. He knew so much by the time he got to college that I think the fact that he was seen immediately almost as a kind of prodigy fits in. But most of the scientists I've written about over the years who were really exceptional in their fields started as children, started very early in whatever line of work they were going, or something similar that they were going to follow for the rest of their lives. He's a very good example of that.
Yeah, interesting. And he mentions at one point that Robert Oppenheimer was one of his scientific heroes. And of course, you've written about Oppenheimer in your two magisterial books on the history of nuclear weapons, books that I just devoured and venerate, terrific books, very different from this. So what was it that triggered in you the desire to do a biography of Ed?
You know, it's funny, I've written 2 book-length biographies. The other was of John James Audubon. So I guess getting away from what my biologist daughter thinks of as the sterile field of physics. But more than that, Ed and I have been friends for more than 40 years. And we always talked about writing his biography. And as he's moved into his 90s, it really did seem as if it was time. And as I moved into my 80s as well, I thought we'd better get this job done. And he agreed while he was still around, while I was still around. But I didn't really think about the fact that I was going to have to learn some biology along the way. I never studied biology. And it was very painful to get up to some kind of speed with Ed and his biology. That was a nice little side experience, I suppose. But most of all, it was, you know, what has fascinated me about Ed all along, and I think is central to who he is that he's one of those rare human beings who just keeps growing and expanding across a lifetime. Most of us, it seems to me, reach a certain point where we stop and we stay there, and maybe we decline from that point. But he started out looking at ants as a barefoot boy, and now he's writing a whole new synthesis of ecology, of what he calls ecosystems, at the very largest scale of his science. That's the book he's been writing currently. This is an extraordinarily rich human life. And it would have been a shame if it passed, well, he's written about his own life so well, but to have a chance to look at it from the outside as well was something I really thought needed to be done.
Mhm, mhm. There's an important point of inflection in Ed's life story in the early years that not everyone, even among his fans, are aware of. And it's when, at the age of 7, he lost the sight in his right eye. He was fishing, he jerked a fish out of the water, a pinfish, it came, and a fin punctured his eye, eventually lost the sight completely. And he says, there's a wonderful sentence that I quoted in the introduction to the Library of America volume, and it's in Naturalist. And he says, well along in his autobiography, he says, I am blind in one eye and cannot hear high frequency sounds. He lost that ability later on. Semicolon. Therefore, I am an entomologist.
Yes.
I love that. And he's telling us much there. One of the things he's telling us is that he had, with his other eye, an extraordinary ability for close focus acuity. He was the one who couldn't identify the bird, the brown bird sitting on the brown tree 50 yards away, but he could bear down with a hand lens and count the hairs on the thorax of an ant and therefore distinguish one species of ant from another. And at the same time, is having that close focus ability, which shows itself over and over again with his attention to detail, to particularity, to the thingness one by one of individuals and populations of animals and other creatures. He also has this great hunger to step back and to see patterns, discern patterns, create hypotheses and theories about these particularities. So I asked the two of you, how rare is that? How many scientists have that sort of dual capacity?
Yeah, this is really important. Going back to the theory of island biogeography and reading the opening of that book, where he just says something simple. What does he says? He says the island is the unit that we want to come to. It's a great place to study. And he just gradually, sweetly, nicely, I hear his voice, introducing this whole complex book by saying, islands are a good place to start. Let's start here. I think here's why. And it's very pellucid, it's very clear, and you think, God, I feel so comfortable here. I'm going to be able to understand everything in this book. Of course, I don't, but it still makes you feel like you could. And one of the neat things about Ed that I think distinguishes him is that he's a great narrator. One of the great narrators of science, just one of the great narrators of America now. And it's why he has made such a huge audience. And he's developing that narrator quality, that narrative, his ability to speak and describe, both as a scientist and as an author, and that's interesting. So it's, you know, islands of the island biogeography theory is this dialogue between, I think, mostly Ed's narrative and MacArthur's math, and it's a great dialogue. It just goes back and forth throughout the book in really fun ways, and that's important to all of us. It's Ed's way of saying, the narrative is still important. It's really important to be a narrator, and he keeps bringing narrators with him. He cultivates narrators. David, I think, isn't that right? And Richard, he cultivates them. I mean, Tony Hiss has got a new book, the New Yorker writer, in that Ed has really cultivated Tony in a way, and developing those ideas that Tony's developed his new book. But he's always developing the importance of narrative, and that is one of the things that's been lost from a lot of science.
Yeah, Ed is a classic example, I think, of the Southerner who had two rich sources of narrative experience in his background. One, reading the Bible, and reading, I suspect, the King James Bible with all of its rich language. And the other is storytelling, which he lived in the South, as so many Southern children do, within his somewhat extended family. So that background and his own gifts, natural gifts of language, set him up to be someone who's a very successful popular writer. He's had many best-selling books on the New York Times bestseller list. And then on the other side, he's a very disciplined, linguistically disciplined writer of scientific research. He's one of those scientists who insists on using the right technical term, so that I spent a great deal of time with the Oxford English Dictionary looking up terms that I'd never seen before, some of which are not even in the OED. I don't think he coined them, but I think they're just that rare. But these two things come together to make for a kind of writing that is thrilling for anyone, no matter how much you personally have read, that on the one hand tells stories that you could get into, and at the same time stretches you to try to understand ideas that are unfamiliar to you and to learn thereby. Ed has written 34, I think he's on his 35th book, and he's published more than 400 scientific papers. This leaves out all the lectures and talks, and all the other things that he's done as well. So he's and that on top of having had a full-time career as a professor teaching at Harvard and as a professional scientist in field studies and writing up all those papers. He's been an immensely productive human being. He says he's a workaholic, and no doubt he is, but the result has been this huge body of work informed by the kind of rich, almost King Jamesian language.
Someone told me, I can't remember if it was Ed or another friend, that Ed had the habit when he got on an airplane, he would sit down, he would buckle his seatbelt, and then he would pull out a yellow legal pad and pick up in the middle of a sentence or a paragraph working on the latest book. Can you confirm that, Richard?
I can believe that. I mean, Anthony Trollope was famous for writing novels at a fast clip, and as soon as he finished one, he would immediately start the next one, as if it was all just pouring out of his head. I can see that Ed might be that way as well.
Let's get some more of Ed's words into this. Can either or both of you give us a sampler paragraph or two that's a particular favorite?
Mm-hmm. I have one.
Give us a little reading, yeah.
Yeah.
So we hear this voice that we're talking about.
This is another side of Ed that we haven't discussed. I think when we're being celebratory, we should be aware that he has a rather tragic view of the world. This is in his book on human nature. The reflective person knows that his life is in some incomprehensible manner guided through a biological ontogeny, a more or less fixed order of life stages. He senses that with all the drive, wit, love, pride, anger, hope, and anxiety that characterize the species, he will, in the end, be sure only of helping to perpetrate the same cycle. Poets have defined this truth as tragedy. The first dilemma, in a word, is that we have no particular place to go. The species lacks any goal external to its own biological nature. Now, I was taught in college that Copernicus made the world from a place where the Earth is at the center of the universe to a place where Earth was simply orbiting a third-rate star out at the edge of a galaxy. And Darwin removed the human species, if you will, from being a special creation of God's to simply another organism among all the organisms. And Freud taught us that much of human behavior and knowledge was unconscious and not informed as much by reason as we like to think it was. I think Ed fits in the next part of that, which is we are also, like all animal species, essentially here to reproduce our kind, and that we have no particular millennial goal that was built into us somehow by God or biology or whatever one wants to think of it as a motive force. So I put Ed in that canon with this quotation.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Bill, what about you? A favorite passage?
Yeah,
Just
so there are a lot, and I really have begun to focus more and more on Ed's ideas about the different ways that people see the world and interpret the world, and the different mechanisms that you can do it. So in Biophilia, the poetic species, is a very interesting chapter. And I think from Ed's viewpoint, it's something we deal with a lot here at our research center, where we say, well, we're about science, but we're also about drawing other visions of the natural world into our sphere of understanding so that we understand it better. And I don't know exactly where to stop in this, but each human mindscape is idiosyncratic and yet ultimately obedient to biological law. Like the forest of some newly discovered island, it possesses unique contours and previously undescribed forms of life, treasures to be valued for their own sake, but the genetic process that spawned them is the same as elsewhere. And it's that connection that he's making, that there are many different ways of seeing this vision, and it all connects back to this intimate connection with the rest of the world, with the rest of life, with the rest of the universe, and how important each of those visions are. I also feel like I ought to add, when we've talked about Ed and how different some of his thoughts are, a lot of scientists just sort of want to come in and occupy the room. This is describe everything that has to be described in their little world. Ed's about walking down the hall and opening doors. I mean, that's why we keep getting these books from him. It's like, look, take a look at this door. Let's look at this door. Let's look at this door. He never fully explores it, but boy, does he open up a new universe every time he opens a door.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to connect. And are we out of time?
One thing. Can I add just one thing?
Yes, go ahead, Richard.
Ed is one of those people who, yes, opens new doors rather than focuses on one thing. It's a quality that I think has produced in some of his colleagues a great deal of envy and jealousy on the one hand, over the years, I mean, of his life, and at the same time left others thinking he was in some way superficial. But I don't think anyone thinks that anymore. but he had that struggle sometimes because he thinks of himself to some degree as an entrepreneur of science, as someone who is starting new businesses, if you will. Only in his case, it's whole new scientific fields like sociobiology. It's really quite extraordinary how he steps in this new work that he's doing on ecosystems. He told me recently he had pulled 10 years of issues of the journals Science and Nature and was going through them and ripping out any paper that seemed to connect to the subject he was thinking about. He ends up with stacks and stacks and stacks of papers. And from those, that becomes the raw material for a synthesis that he pulls together from all this material. It's really quite an extraordinary way to work. And we need people like that in the fields, obviously.
Here's a passage. This may be the point where we shift to questions from our audience, but here's a passage that connects with that, Richard. This is from Naturalist, page 123 in the original version. Of course, Ed has always been a teacher as well as a scientist and a writer, teaching at Harvard for decades. And if, as I understand correctly, making a point of teaching introductory biology to roomfuls of hundreds of Harvard students because he considered that important. But of course, he also had graduate students, people who wanted to go on and be scientists themselves. And in Naturalist, he says this: "The advice I give to students in science is to move laterally and up and down and peer all around. If you have the will, there is a discipline in which you can succeed. Look for the ones still thinly populated, where fine differences in raw ability matter less. Be a hunter and explorer, not a problem solver."
This was his own behavior, of course. When he went into Harvard as a graduate student in the Society of Fellows, he noticed that everyone was working over here, and he decided to go as far away as possible. And he used his fellowship to do something at the age of 25 that few people ever get to do. He traversed the entire South Pacific, collecting ants on islands where no one had ever collected before, and brought home for the Harvard Museum more than 1,000 new species of ants. Many of them, as I said, never identified before. So he really, he followed his own advice to his great benefit.
Let me ask just one more question, and the two of you can answer this just off the top of your head, and then we'll shift back to Max, and we'll hear some questions from our audience. But to the two of you, many people know Ed from having read a book or two. To the person who wants to read more, wants to read another 3 or 4 of his books, what stand at the top of the list for you? What are the key books in the Wilson canon?
Biophilia is key for most folks. I mean, it's just a great introduction to how we fit. Diversity of life is interesting because, boy, I wish I had that as a textbook when I was young and was trying to understand biology. It's an incredible introduction to biology and to evolutionary biology, just a compendium that's beautiful. And The Naturalist is a history of how people have understood science over the past 60 or 70 years.
For the record, we didn't pay Bill to say that. Those are the 3 books that are in this volume from the Library of America.
Surely there's a reason Library of America chose those books. Right?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say Naturalist because, of course, it's also a wonderful introduction to Ed himself, since it's to some degree his autobiography. But I would add to that, and I think in some ways this is one of his very best books, On Human Nature. He wrote that after being bitterly attacked for his introduction of the whole field of sociobiology. And it's in a way, it's his book Sociobiology rewritten for the lay reader. But it draws on some pretty deep philosophic lines of thinking about humanity and who we are and how we came to be and our limitations. All of that is there. It's a beautiful book.
Thank you.
Max.
Thank you all very much. We have a lot of very passionate questions from our audience. It's hard to know where to start, but this one, Steve Swinburne, who is viewing from South Londonderry, Vermont, says, my granddaughter is 3. What does Ed Wilson think planet Earth will be like for her in 2050? And does he have children himself?
Ed has an adopted daughter, the only child that was in their family. He's kind of optimistic. He sees us as finding our way through, assuming we're all willing to get involved and push forward. What he really wonders about is what we're going to do 200 years from now when we have solved all of these basic problems of life and come up against the fact that we don't have any place to go, if you will. That was the passage that I read from his book On Human Nature. But I think he's fundamentally optimistic about it. I'm not sure I agree with him. We really do face some very serious problems. But I think he would tell that little girl, buck up, it's a great world. And most of the species in the world haven't even been identified yet. particularly the small ones. So there's an open field for anyone who wants to go out and continue the work of science.
Excellent. Anyone else want to weigh in? There's another question from Leon Green, who's writing from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He says, I'm a science educator and Dr. Wilson serves as a constant inspiration to me. I even have the word consilience as one of my tattoos. As people who know him well, what do you think he feels is the most important role he plays in our society today?
Well, from my perspective, I think what he's thinking about a lot right now is how he can help shepherd us to the next big thing, which is the biodiversity crisis, extinction crisis and biodiversity loss, where our minds are on climate change, but we must raise our ambition now to care for the rest of life, the living world. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, we can address, if we bring the rest of life with us, and really Earth could be a paradise. And so to really focus in now, understand everything we can about our planet and work to raise our ambition to protect the bulk of biodiversity on the Earth. That's part of his book, Half Earth, which is the work of our organization to protect half the Earth in order to safeguard the bulk of biodiversity.
Mm-hmm. To save what's left of wilderness in the world and to reconnect where possible. Ed points out in his discussions about Half Earth, if we lose a forest, we can replace it in a few generations. But if you lose a species, if a species goes extinct, it takes millions of years to replace this, and it will never be replaced in its existing form. That's why he wants to emphasize not only the larger environmental destruction of global warming, but also the destruction that's going with it of species extinction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Consilience is a fascinating, complicated, challenging book, a daring book. Max, who was that question from?
That was from Leanne, I'm not sure how you pronounced the name, L-I-A-N-E, Leon Green from Fort Lauderdale.
Well, I think passingly, in all good spirit, we should also congratulate her on the most nerdy tattoo that in the last month or two.
Well, I mean, speaking of the Half Earth Project, there are many questions about that, and I'll just run through some of them, and you can take any of them that you like. James Lyons of Edgewater, Maryland, says, what criteria should guide the identification of lands for the Half Earth Project? Ann Millbrook from Bozeman, Montana, says, what are the leading arguments for formal federal wilderness designation, in your opinion? Howard Weller from UK writes, what are the levers of power to promote biodiversity? In other words, he's thinking about what are the political paths to it. Georgia Boss from Portland, Oregon says, how do we nominate a piece of land for the project? And Josh Ballesteri of Buffalo says, what are our chances of achieving Half Earth? So just on this general subject, take any of those that you like and go for it.
Paula, can I jump up and down on that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Half Earth is one of those doors that Ed opened. Mm-hmm. And he has left it to us to really explore what that door means in a big way, and naturally, because it's a huge universe of thinking that will be required to make Half Earth work. We have some good indications from Ed's books as to how that works. I do think as we talk about 30 for 30, and other concepts that are coming into focus right now, we do need to put biodiversity. We need to rank biodiversity very high in how we set conservation values. We don't always do that. Sometimes having a big piece of land is really nice. Protecting one species over large areas is something we think is okay. But biodiversity itself needs to play a huge role in this decision making, and we just can't lose that. Even with climate, as Richard says, climate's hugely important to this decision making process. I agree, but boy, if we lose the biodiversity, it may not matter that we've lost the climate.
Well, to follow that, the largest number of questions are on the question of, what can I do? There's to say, Cindy Lang from Thomaston, Maine says, could the panelists make some suggestions for what everyday individuals can be doing now to help? We're watching our planet in peril, our extinction crisis more critical than our climate emergency, yet biodiversity and extinction are far from household conversations and actions. I am 75 years old. I live in Thomaston, Maine. I want to help, engage, and activate to conserve. What can I do? And I should say there are, Darmel Hudson from Fort Worth, Texas, Tom Murtha from Norfolk, Connecticut, Linda Castaneda from Cincinnati, Martin Edeker from the UK. They're all asking a version of that question.
Can I say a word on that to start? Conservation of biological diversity globally begins at home, of course. Every decision that we make as individuals has an impact on the collective human footprint, on wildness, on biological diversity around the world. The choices that we make, what to consume, what we eat, what we wear, how much we travel, how much fossil fuel we burn, how many children we have if we choose to have children. All of those things add up to our individual footprint on the natural world, and you add up 8 billion of those and you have the collective footprint. So I think in addition to lobbying our governments and working through local organizations and being members of NGOs that do wonderful work, like the work that's gone into conserving Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, which Ed has been much involved with through Greg Carr and his old student, Peter Nasgrecki. In addition to those kinds of things, the simple things that we do as consumers, reproducers, if we are reproducers, have an impact, and we need to think about that and take responsibility for that every minute of the day.
That I think is a good place. It's 7 o'clock, so I think that probably is an excellent note to go out on. Thank you very much to all of you. To the audience, you've been listening to Paula Erhlich, Bill Finch, David Quammen, and Richard Rhodes discuss the life and work of Edward O. Wilson. His writing has just been published in a new volume in the Library of America, number 340 in the series, edited by David Quammen. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America, including programs on Joan Didion, on the Mississippi-born writer Elizabeth Spencer, and a celebration of American birds and their influence on the poets and writers that they've inspired, among many others. Details about these and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's new E.O. Wilson volume and links to purchase that and other volumes of great American writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Paula, Bill, David, and Richard, and to Graham Townsley for the wonderful film clip. Have a great evening.